In the spring of 1842, a single enslaved man was sold 17 times across South Carolina in just 9 months, and each transaction destroyed the sanity of the man who purchased him. The records exist in sealed archives, removed from public view in 1889 by officials who couldn't explain what they documented. What happened during those 9 months changed 19 lives forever, and the truth about Isaiah Turner's extraordinary gift remains one of history's most deliberately hidden stories. Before we begin this remarkable journey into forgotten history, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. We uncover the truth about resilience, resistance, and the extraordinary minds that challenged an evil system from within. Now, let me tell you about the man whose memory became a weapon more powerful than any physical resistance could ever be. The Charleston Auction House stood 3 stories tall on Chalmers Street, its red brick facade absorbing the morning heat that rose from cobblestones still damp with overnight rain. Inside, Thomas Whitmore managed the daily operations with the precision of a clockmaker, his ledgers documenting every transaction with meticulous care. March mornings in 1842 brought the usual business: plantation owners seeking laborers for rice fields stretching inland from the coast, merchants looking for skilled craftsmen, wealthy families requiring domestic workers. The routine had continued unchanged for decades, predictable as tides. But on March 15th, something unprecedented walked through those heavy oak doors. A factor named Samuel Grimshaw arrived with paperwork for a man he claimed represented an estate in Savannah. The man standing beside him immediately commanded attention, though not through physical imposing presence. Isaiah Turner stood average height, perhaps 32 years old, with hands that suggested both manual labor and something more refined. His eyes held an unusual quality, focused yet somehow distant, as if he perceived layers of reality others couldn't access. What Isaiah possessed was a gift that would prove more dangerous to slavery's defenders than any rebellion. His memory worked differently than other minds. He could recall conversations verbatim from years past, remember faces he'd seen once in childhood, reconstruct entire ledgers of numbers after a single viewing. More than simple recall, Isaiah understood patterns, connections, the intricate web of relationships and transactions that built the slave economy. And he'd spent his entire life quietly gathering information, storing away every detail about the men who claimed to own human beings. Whitmore recorded Isaiah's details in his auction ledger with customary thoroughness. Male, approximately 32 years of age, literate despite prohibitions, skilled in carpentry and blacksmithing, experienced in household management and bookkeeping, unusually articulate. But what Whitmore couldn't document was the intelligence that burned behind Isaiah's carefully neutral expression, the decades of accumulated knowledge that Isaiah carried like a hidden arsenal. The bidding that day exceeded anything Whitmore had witnessed in 15 years managing Charleston's most prestigious auction house. Plantation owners who normally calculated purchases with cold economic precision suddenly competed with desperate intensity. Colonel James Rutherford opened bidding at $900, already an extraordinary sum for any enslaved person regardless of skills. Within minutes, the price climbed past $1,500. Something about Isaiah compelled these men to abandon rational judgment, to pursue ownership with an urgency that transcended mere acquisition of property. When the hammer finally fell, William Thornton had paid $2,300. Thornton owned 4 plantations totaling 12,000 acres in the Georgetown district. His wealth built across 3 generations of rice cultivation. He was known throughout Charleston society as shrewd, calculating, impossible to manipulate. Yet he just paid nearly 10 times the typical price for a male slave, and his hands trembled slightly as he signed the purchase documents. What Thornton didn't know What none of them knew was that Isaiah had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Every conversation overheard in plantation offices, every ledger glimpsed while cleaning studies, every whispered secret between masters and mistresses, every detail about deaths and affairs and cruelties committed in darkness. Isaiah had stored it all away with perfect recall, waiting for the opportunity to use knowledge as a weapon against the men who thought they could own him. That first night at Thornton's Ashley River plantation, Isaiah was assigned quarters near the main house, a small cabin designated for skilled workers considered valuable enough to monitor closely. As evening fell, Thornton sent for him, requiring assistance with estate paperwork. Isaiah entered the study where Thornton sat surrounded by ledgers, correspondence, documents chronicling the vast machinery of plantation operations. "You claim literacy," Thornton said, his tone suggesting skepticism despite the premium he'd paid. "We'll see if that justifies your extraordinary cost." Isaiah's voice emerged calm, measured, carrying an educated quality that immediately unsettled Thornton. "I can read and write, sir. I can also calculate compound interest, maintain double-entry bookkeeping, and analyze crop yields across multiple seasons to project market valuations." Thornton's expression shifted from skepticism to interest. "Where did you acquire such knowledge?" "From observation, sir, and from memory." Isaiah paused, then continued with deliberate precision. "For instance, I recall overhearing a conversation in Savannah 7 years ago between you and factor named James Middleton. You were discussing diversification of your holdings, concerned about dependency on rice monoculture. You mentioned specific debt obligations totaling $48,000 owed to Charleston Bank and Trust, secured against your Waccamaw plantation. You expressed concern that a single poor harvest season could jeopardize your entire operation." The color drained from Thornton's face. That conversation had occurred in a private office, with only Middleton present. No enslaved person should have overheard it, and certainly no one should remember it with such precision 7 years later. "You're mistaken," Thornton said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Isaiah's expression remained neutral, but his words carried undeniable authority. "Shall I continue? I can recall your correspondence with Overseer Patterson from August 1839, discussing methods for increasing productivity that violated South Carolina labor laws. I remember the amounts you paid to have certain legal violations overlooked by officials. I know about the investments you made in failed cotton speculation that your family remains unaware of. I know about arrangements you maintain in Charleston that would scandalize your wife and children." Thornton stood abruptly, his chair scraping against wooden floors. "How do you know these things?" "I remember everything, sir. Every conversation I've overheard across 32 years. Every document I've glimpsed. Every transaction I've witnessed. My mind retains information with perfect clarity, and I've spent my entire life in proximity to men like you, men who discuss private matters while assuming enslaved people are merely furniture, incapable of understanding or remembering." Isaiah paused, letting the implications settle. "Now you own me, which means every night you'll know that I'm here, remembering everything new I learn about you. Every financial struggle, every moral compromise, every secret you've buried. And unlike documents that can be destroyed or witnesses who can be silenced, memory persists." The conversation continued for hours, though conversation inadequately described what occurred. Isaiah systematically dismantled Thornton's carefully constructed self-image, his belief that his wealth derived from skill and intelligence rather than systematic exploitation. Isaiah recited names of people Thornton had bought and sold, specifics about families separated, children torn from mothers, elderly workers disposed of when their productivity declined. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse, simply remembered aloud with devastating precision. "You purchased a woman named Grace in 1834, Isaiah said as midnight approached. She was 23 years old, had 2 children, ages 4 and 6. You separated her from those children when you sold them to different buyers in different states. Do you remember Grace, sir? I do. I remember her face when they took her children away. I remember the sound she made, a wailing that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the throat. I remember that you recorded the transaction in your ledger with notation, 'Productive female, unencumbered by dependent offspring, suitable for field work.' You reduced a mother's devastation to a positive sales attribute." By dawn, William Thornton sat motionless in his chair, his face gray, his hands clutching the armrests as if physical grip on furniture could provide stability his world no longer offered. Isaiah had forced him to truly see what he'd spent his entire life avoiding, to comprehend the specific human cost of every dollar in his vast fortune. 3 days later, Samuel Grimshaw returned to Whitmore's auction house carrying documentation authorizing Isaiah's resale. Thornton had decided the acquisition was unsuitable for his household needs. Whitmore's careful professional composure fractured. "Sir, Colonel Thornton purchased this man just 72 hours ago for an unprecedented sum. What possible reason could justify such an immediate reversal?" Grimshaw's expression remained placid. "Private matters between owner and property, Mr. Whitmore. The documentation is in order, everything properly notarized and witnessed." The pattern established itself quickly. Every 7 to 10 days, another prominent South Carolina planter purchased Isaiah for progressively higher prices. Each buyer was wealthy, respected, socially prominent. Each kept Isaiah for mere days before authorizing resale through Grimshaw, citing vague unsuitability. And each emerged from the brief ownership fundamentally changed, haunted by something they refused to discuss publicly. Charles Middleton paid $2,800 in late March. He kept Isaiah for 4 days, during which plantation staff reported their master locked himself in his study with the new acquisition for hours each night. Middleton emerged gaunt, aged, his hands developing a tremor. He immediately arranged Isaiah's resale, took a significant financial loss, and began liquidating portions of his holdings. Within months, he'd freed 6 specific enslaved people, individuals whose stories Isaiah had apparently recited during their conversations. Theodore Barnwell purchased Isaiah in early April for $3,200. Barnwell was known throughout Charleston as particularly brutal. His plantations run with harsh efficiency that maximized productivity through terror. He kept Isaiah for only 2 days. Whatever transpired between them remained private, but Barnwell's overseer reported finding his employer seated motionless in his office at dawn, staring at nothing, tears streaming down his face. Barnwell never spoke of what Isaiah had said to him, but he stopped the practice of public whippings, modified punishment protocols, and began allowing enslaved families to remain together, changes so contrary to his previous management style that other planters questioned his sanity. By the 6th sale in May, Whitmore had begun keeping separate private notes documenting the pattern. "These men are not acting from economic rationality," he wrote. "They pursue ownership with desperation, pay astronomical sums, then divest themselves at substantial loss within days. It's as if Isaiah Turner carries some contagion of conscience that wealthy men cannot endure once infected." The truth, though Whitmore couldn't fully articulate it, was that Isaiah possessed a weapon more devastating than any physical force: memory combined with understanding. The ability to hold a mirror to men's souls and force them to see themselves truly. These plantation owners had built elaborate psychological fortifications around their participation in evil, justifications about economic necessity, religious righteousness, natural hierarchy. Isaiah's gift allowed him to dismantle those fortifications systematically, using each man's own words, decisions, and actions as evidence against their carefully maintained self-images. What made Isaiah's approach particularly powerful was its gentleness. He never raised his voice, never threatened, never expressed anger or hatred. He simply remembered. He recited facts with perfect accuracy, asked questions that exposed logical contradictions, helped each owner understand precisely what they had chosen to participate in. The devastation came not from Isaiah attacking them, but from them finally seeing themselves clearly. Hampton Alston purchased Isaiah in June for $4,100, a figure representing nearly half his annual plantation profits. Alston came from one of South Carolina's oldest families, his lineage traceable to colonial aristocracy. He prided himself on being an enlightened master, treating his slaves better than most, providing adequate food and shelter, rarely resorting to physical punishment. He considered himself morally superior to crueler planters. Isaiah destroyed that comfortable self-perception in a single night. "You treat them better than others," Isaiah acknowledged, "which allows you to feel virtuous while still participating in their enslavement. You provide adequate food, but they remain property. You avoid excessive physical punishment, but you still punish. You keep families together when economically feasible, but you reserve the right to separate them when business requires it. Your gentler approach doesn't make the fundamental relationship any less evil. It simply makes your complicity easier for you to live with." Isaiah recited the names of 43 people Alston currently owned, 43 individuals with stories, dreams, capabilities, loves, losses. He remembered conversations Alston had forgotten, moments when enslaved people had demonstrated intelligence or creativity or humor in Alston's presence, moments Alston had witnessed without truly seeing, because he couldn't reconcile human complexity with property designation. "You remember Marcus?" Isaiah asked. "The man who manages your tool shed? He taught himself mathematics by studying your children's school books when they discarded them. He can calculate compound interest, solve geometric problems, understand concepts you'd say only educated white men can grasp. But you see him as good with tools, reliable property, never recognizing the intellect that exceeds your own children's capabilities. How many others have you failed to truly see? How many minds have you owned without ever acknowledging their humanity?" Alston lasted 3 days before arranging Isaiah's resale. He took a financial loss that strained his operations for months. He subsequently modified his plantation management, but unlike some previous buyers, he couldn't bring himself to free anyone. The understanding Isaiah had forced upon him existed in constant warfare with his economic interests and social position. He spent the rest of his life caught between knowledge and complicity, a psychological torment that aged him rapidly. The prices continued climbing. By July, Isaiah sold for $5,500 to Robert Pringle, whose family controlled shipping interests throughout the Carolinas. Pringle kept him for 5 days, the longest ownership yet, perhaps because his participation in slavery operated at greater remove. He didn't own plantations or directly manage enslaved workers. He simply moved cotton, rice, and other products to market. He told himself he was just a merchant, that he wasn't responsible for how those products were produced. Isaiah helped him understand the falsehood of that separation. "You transport 6,000 bales of cotton annually," Isaiah said, his voice carrying quiet certainty. "Each bale represents approximately 6 weeks of labor by enslaved workers. Your ships carry products created by people who received nothing for their work, who enriched others while remaining property themselves. You facilitate the entire system. Without merchants like you, plantation slavery couldn't function efficiently. You're not separate from it, you're essential to it." Isaiah recited details about Pringle's business operations, conversations about maximizing cargo capacity, negotiations about transport rates, calculations about profit margins. He showed Pringle how every financial decision connected directly to human suffering, how the wealth Pringle accumulated derived from systematic exploitation, even though he never personally whipped anyone or separated families. "You've built a fortune by making the unthinkable routine," Isaiah continued. "You've reduced human agony to shipping manifests and profit ledgers. You sleep well because you've convinced yourself you're just moving products. But those products are created by people who are themselves treated as products. Your conscience rests on willful blindness." Pringle emerged from those 5 days financially devastated and spiritually broken. He arranged Isaiah's resale, then began withdrawing from his family's shipping business, a decision that caused family crisis. His brothers couldn't understand why he'd suddenly developed concerns about trades they'd conducted for generations. By August, whispers spread through Charleston's elite. Something about Isaiah Turner terrified the men who purchased him, though no one would explain exactly what. The pattern defied rational understanding. Wealthy, powerful men competed desperately to own him, paid ridiculous sums, then couldn't divest themselves quickly enough. Some speculated about disease, others about witchcraft, but those close to the situation recognized something more profound was occurring. Whitmore found himself in an impossible position. The transactions were legal, documented properly, violated no laws. Yet he felt increasingly complicit in something that transcended mere commerce. He'd built his career facilitating slave sales, always telling himself he was simply a professional conducting business. But Isaiah's repeated sales forced Whitmore to contemplate his own role more deeply than he'd ever permitted himself. David Hammond, a former Charleston constable who now conducted private investigations, approached Whitmore one evening after the auction house had closed. Hammond had been quietly gathering information about the Isaiah Turner transactions, compiling reports for clients who wanted to understand the pattern. "I've interviewed 7 of the men who've purchased him," Hammond told Whitmore, spreading his notes across the desk. "None will speak directly about what occurred, but their behavior suggests psychological trauma. 3 have sought medical help for insomnia and anxiety. 2 have begun drinking heavily. 1 told his physician he hears voices, conversations replaying in his mind with perfect clarity. They all use similar language when pressed. They say Isaiah remembers things, or knows things, or makes you understand. They speak about him as if he possesses supernatural abilities." "Do you believe that?" Whitmore asked. "Supernatural abilities?" "I believe Isaiah Turner has an extraordinary memory, possibly what some physicians call total recall. Combined with intelligence and decades of careful observation, that gives him detailed knowledge about Charleston's elite. Knowledge is power, Mr. Whitmore, especially knowledge people desperately want kept secret. But I think there's something more. The men I've interviewed don't just fear exposure of secrets, they seem fundamentally changed, as if Isaiah forced them to see themselves differently." Hammond consulted his notes. "I spoke with Theodore Barnwell's personal valet, a man named Isaac, who's worked for the family for 20 years. Isaac said that after Mr. Barnwell sent Isaiah back to Charleston, his master changed completely, started asking Isaac questions, personal questions, about his life, his family, his hopes. Questions no master had ever asked before. Barnwell suddenly seemed to recognize Isaac as fully human, and that recognition tormented him because he couldn't reconcile it with continuing to own Isaac. The contradiction drove him to despair. This pattern repeated across other buyers. Men who'd participated in slavery for decades suddenly confronted the humanity of people they'd treated as property. Isaiah didn't reveal this truth through argument or accusation. He demonstrated it through memory, through reciting the specific stories of specific individuals, through making abstract evil concrete and personal. The 9th sale occurred in September. Jonathan Beaufort paid $6,800, a sum equivalent to 6 years of profit from a medium-sized plantation. Beaufort was younger than previous buyers, only 34, recently inherited vast holdings from his father. He represented the next generation of South Carolina aristocracy, Men who'd grown up with slavery as natural as sunrise, who'd never seriously questioned the system that enriched them. Isaiah spent 6 nights in conversation with Beaufort, the longest sustained interaction yet. What transpired between them remained private, but plantation staff reported Beaufort emerging each dawn looking increasingly devastated, his youth seeming to drain away with each conversation. On the 6th night, witnesses heard raised voices, not anger, but anguish. Beaufort's voice crying, "But what else could we have done? The economy depends on it. Our entire way of life requires it." Isaiah's response carried through closed doors with quiet certainty. Required is the word men use when they choose to do wrong. Nothing requires evil except the decision to commit evil. Your economy depends on slavery because your ancestors chose to build an economy dependent on slavery. You could choose differently, but choosing differently would cost you comfort, wealth, power, so you maintain what you inherited and call it necessity. Beaufort freed 18 enslaved people the day he sent Isaiah back to Charleston. Not all his slaves, only 18, specific individuals whose stories had particular meaning. The partial manumission satisfied no one. Abolitionists considered it inadequate, while fellow slaveholders saw it as dangerous precedent. Beaufort himself existed afterward in tortured middle ground, unable to fully reject the system that enriched him, unable to participate without crushing guilt. As autumn deepened, the pattern approached its conclusion. Whitmore's private notes documented 13 sales completed, prices climbing beyond any rational calculation. The men who'd purchased Isaiah were changed irrevocably. Their comfortable participation in evil transformed into unbearable knowledge. Some had freed enslaved people. Others had modified their practices. None had escaped psychological damage. But 2 more sales remained. Isaiah had told Whitmore during a brief private conversation that the sequence required 15 total transactions. 15 men would receive education about what they'd chosen to participate in. 15 would learn that no amount of cultural tradition, economic justification, or social pressure could transform evil into righteousness. Why 15? Whitmore had asked. Because these 15 represent different levels of participation, Isaiah had answered. Planters who directly own and manage, merchants who facilitate the system, politicians who defend it legally, physicians who provide medical justification for it, ministers who provide religious justification. Each must understand their specific complicity. The 14th sale went to Reverend Marcus Caldwell, minister of Charleston's prestigious St. Michael's Church. Caldwell had preached countless sermons about the biblical righteousness of slavery, arguing that it represented God's plan for organizing human society. He'd provided moral comfort to generations of slaveholders, assuring them that their actions aligned with divine will. Isaiah systematically dismantled every theological argument Caldwell had ever made, not through theological debate, but through memory. Isaiah recited Caldwell's own sermons, then juxtaposed them with biblical passages that directly contradicted his interpretations. He remembered every logical inconsistency, every selective quotation, every moment when Caldwell had twisted Scripture to justify what culture demanded. "You quoted Paul's letter to Philemon," Isaiah said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd memorized extensive texts. "But you emphasized Paul's instruction that Onesimus return to his master, while ignoring Paul's statement that Philemon should receive him no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother. You built entire sermons on verses about servants obeying masters, while neglecting verses about treating others as you'd be treated, about loving neighbors as yourself, about the equality of all souls before God." Isaiah recited speeches Caldwell had given defending slavery as a positive good, then contrasted them with passages describing liberation, justice, the fundamental dignity of every human being.
He showed Caldwell exactly how he'd manipulated sacred texts to serve political and economic interests, how he'd used his religious authority to sanctify evil. Do you truly believe God ordains this system? Or have you simply chosen to interpret Scripture in ways that maintain your comfortable position in society that benefits from slavery? You're a minister. You claim to speak for divine truth. But you've spent decades using that authority to ease the consciences of men who profit from suffering. How many slaveholders sat easier in their pews because your sermons assured them God approved their actions? Caldwell lasted only one night before he sent Isaiah back.
The Reverend took ill immediately afterward, a sickness physicians couldn't diagnose but congregants recognized as spiritual crisis. He never preached about slavery again, citing uncertainty about God's will on complex political matters. His sermons became tentative, lacking the confident authority that had defined his ministry. Some congregants appreciated the newfound humility, while others felt betrayed by his sudden silence on what they considered settled biblical questions. One sale remained, the 15th and final transaction. Whitmore knew it would be significant, that Isaiah's pattern demanded a conclusion that encompassed all previous lessons. When Samuel Grimshaw arrived with documentation authorizing Isaiah's final sale, Whitmore noticed the factor's usual placid expression had shifted into something resembling anticipation. "This last sale requires special circumstances," Grimshaw said. "The final buyer must be someone whose position embodies the complete system. Someone who represents not just economic participation, but philosophical justification. Someone who shaped the legal and cultural framework that permits slavery to continue." "You're describing someone specific," Whitmore said. "Senator James Whitfield," Grimshaw confirmed. "He'll be attending tomorrow's auction." Whitfield represented South Carolina in the United States Senate, where he'd become one of slavery's most articulate defenders. He'd authored legislation protecting the institution, delivered speeches arguing for its expansion into Western territories, crafted legal theories about state sovereignty and property rights that provided constitutional justification for human bondage. His intellectual defenses of slavery influenced policy across the entire South. The auction attracted unprecedented attention. Charleston's elite filled Whitmore's establishment beyond capacity, drawn by rumors about the final sale of the mysterious man who tormented 13 previous owners. Whitmore recognized faces that rarely appeared at auctions: politicians, lawyers, physicians, ministers, men whose relationship to slavery operated at levels beyond simple ownership. When Whitfield entered, the crowd parted reflexively. At 48, he carried himself with authority earned through political success. His tailored clothes and confident bearing marked him as someone accustomed to deference. He'd come to purchase Isaiah as a curiosity, amused by stories about previous buyers' difficulties, certain he'd experience nothing similar. The bidding opened at $5,000 and climbed immediately. But Whitfield dominated the process. His bids delivered with casual certainty that communicated wealth and power. When the hammer fell at $9,200, the amount represented the highest price ever documented for any enslaved person in South Carolina history. Whitfield signed the purchase documents without hesitation, arranged for Isaiah's transport to his Charleston townhouse, and departed with the confidence of someone who'd just acquired interesting property. That evening, Isaiah arrived at Whitfield's residence, a 3-story brick structure on Meeting Street that served as both home and political office. Whitfield directed him to a study lined with books, legislative documents, correspondence from fellow senators. It was a room designed to impress, to demonstrate the intellectual authority behind Whitfield's political power. "I've heard remarkable stories about you," Whitfield began, settling into a leather chair. "Men claiming you possess supernatural abilities, others saying you drove them to madness. I'm curious what tricks you employ." "No tricks, Senator," Isaiah replied, "only memory. I remember everything I've ever witnessed, every conversation I've overheard, every document I've glimpsed. And I've spent 32 years observing men who participate in slavery. I've accumulated considerable knowledge." Whitefield smiled, amused rather than concerned. "Knowledge is meaningless without context. You might know details about individual lives, but you lack education in philosophy, law, political economy. You can't comprehend the complex forces that make slavery necessary to Southern prosperity." "Can't I?" Isaiah's expression remained neutral. "Let me demonstrate my understanding, Senator. You delivered a speech in the Senate chamber on March 14, 1838. You argued that slavery represented a positive good, beneficial to both enslaved and enslaver. You claimed it civilized and Christianized people who would otherwise remain savage. You stated that Southern plantations provided better conditions than Northern factories provided free workers. You argued that ending slavery would devastate the Southern economy and harm the very people abolitionists claimed to help." Isaiah paused, letting the senator's own words hang in the air. "I remember that speech perfectly, every argument you constructed. Shall I dismantle them systematically?" What followed consumed 7 hours. Isaiah recited Whitefield's speeches, letters, legislative proposals, then methodically revealed the logical contradictions, historical inaccuracies, and moral failures embedded in each argument. He demonstrated how Whitefield's economic claims ignored basic mathematics, how his constitutional theories contradicted the Declaration of Independence principles, how his religious justifications required ignoring half the Bible. But Isaiah went deeper than mere intellectual critique. He remembered specific people Whitefield had encountered, enslaved individuals who demonstrated intelligence, creativity, dignity in the senator's presence. Moments Whitefield had witnessed without truly seeing, because acknowledging what he saw would undermine everything his career was built upon. "You met a man named Josiah in 1835. Isaiah said. "He was owned by your colleague, Senator Calhoun. Josiah served you dinner during a political gathering at Calhoun's plantation. You discussed constitutional law that evening, complex theories about federal versus state power. Josiah stood in that room for 2 hours, silent, serving food. You never considered that he understood every word of your conversation, that he'd taught himself to read using newspapers he found, that he'd memorized large portions of the Constitution you were debating." Isaiah continued, relentless. "After you left, Josiah discussed your arguments with other enslaved people in the quarters. He identified flaws in your constitutional reasoning that legal scholars wouldn't recognize for another decade. He possessed intellect that exceeded yours, Senator, but you saw only a servant. How many Josiahs have you encountered without recognition? How many minds, equal or superior to yours, have you dismissed because acknowledging their humanity would destroy the foundations of your political philosophy?" As dawn approached, Whitefield's confident authority had crumbled completely. Isaiah had forced him to confront the specific human cost of his political career, the families separated by laws he'd written, the suffering perpetuated by systems he'd defended, the intellects and potential destroyed by an institution he'd philosophically justified. "But what else could we have done?" Whitefield asked, echoing Jonathan Beaufort's earlier question. "The economy, the social order, everything we've built depends on this system." "You chose to build it that way," Isaiah replied with quiet firmness. "Your ancestors chose it. You've chosen to perpetuate it. Every political speech, every legislative act, every intellectual justification you've constructed represents a choice to maintain evil because ending it would cost you personally. You've sacrificed others' humanity to preserve your comfort, and you've called that sacrifice necessity." The sun rose over Charleston.
light filtering through study windows to illuminate a senator whose entire worldview had been systematically demolished. Whitfield sat motionless, his face gray, his hands trembling. Whatever certainties had guided his political career had been stripped away, leaving only unbearable understanding of what he'd chosen to be. 3 days later, Whitfield authorized Isaiah's sale back to Grimshaw. But this time, the transaction differed from previous sales. Whitfield filed manumission papers simultaneously, using his political influence to expedite documentation normally requiring months of bureaucratic processing. Isaiah Turner received legal freedom within 48 hours, along with funds sufficient for transport north and establishment in a free state. "I can't own you," Whitfield explained when delivering the papers. His voice sounded hollow, scraped clean of whatever confidence had sustained his political career. "I can't own anyone anymore."
I understand now what that means, what I've been participating in. I can't undo the legislation I've authored, can't erase the speeches I've delivered, can't restore the lives my political career has helped destroy, but I can't continue. I can't. Whitfield never returned to the Senate. He resigned his position citing health concerns, a resignation that shocked political allies across the South. He spent his remaining years in relative isolation, occasionally writing letters to abolitionist newspapers expressing remorse for his previous positions. His former colleagues considered him a traitor. Abolitionists considered his conversion too late to matter. He existed afterward in no man's land between positions, psychologically destroyed by finally understanding himself truly. Isaiah Turner departed Charleston with his freedom papers and never returned. Records show he traveled to Philadelphia, where Pennsylvania's established free black community provided opportunities unavailable in the South. Beyond that, documentation becomes sparse. No census records, no property holdings, no death certificate. It's as if Isaiah accomplished his purpose and then quietly vanished from verifiable history. But the effects of those 9 months persisted. 15 men had received education about their complicity in systematic evil. Some had freed enslaved people. Others had modified their practices. Several had withdrawn from public life entirely. None had escaped psychological damage. They'd been forced to see themselves truly, to understand the specific human cost of their wealth and power, and that understanding had destroyed the comfortable self-images that allowed them to participate in evil while maintaining belief in their own righteousness. Thomas Whitmore continued operating his auction house, but Isaiah's sales had changed him fundamentally. He began documenting transactions differently, including details about families separated, noting when children were sold away from parents, recording the human cost alongside financial figures. His ledgers transformed from business records into evidence of systematic cruelty, though he lacked the courage to stop facilitating sales entirely. He existed in tortured awareness, complicit yet unable to break free from the profession that defined him. In 1852, Whitmore attempted to write a comprehensive account of what had happened during those 9 months in 1842. He produced dozens of incomplete manuscripts, each trying to explain the impossible pattern of sales, each abandoned as inadequate. His final attempt began with this statement: "I have spent 10 years trying to understand Isaiah Turner. Whether he possessed supernatural abilities or simply extraordinary memory combined with uncommon intelligence remains unclear. What I know with certainty is that he changed 15 men permanently." He forced us to see what we'd chosen to ignore, to understand our participation in systematic evil, to comprehend that no amount of cultural tradition or economic pressure transforms wrong into right. That education destroyed us more thoroughly than any physical punishment could have done. We learned that you cannot truly own another human being without destroying something essential in yourself. And once you understand that truth, you cannot unknow it. The manuscript ended incomplete, Whitmore apparently unable to continue. When he died in 1858, his papers passed to his son, who donated them to the South Carolina Historical Society. In 1889, concerned about how Northern publications might weaponize these records, officials quietly removed several pages documenting Isaiah's sales. The pages were placed in restricted archives where they remained for over a century, accessible only with special approval rarely granted. But whispers persisted among historians who studied antebellum Charleston. Stories about the man who was sold 15 times, about conversations that lasted entire nights, about powerful men who emerged from those conversations fundamentally broken. Some dismissed it as legend or exaggeration. Others recognized it as truth too dangerous to openly acknowledge. What Isaiah Turner demonstrated was that resistance to evil takes many forms. Physical rebellion, while dramatic, often proves less effective than psychological resistance, the quiet, systematic dismantling of justifications that allow evil to continue. Isaiah's gift was perfect memory, combined with the courage to speak truth directly to power's face. He forced men to see themselves truly, and that vision destroyed them. Consider what that means. 15 men spent their lives participating in slavery, some directly through ownership, others through facilitation, justification, legal protection, religious sanction. They built elaborate psychological defenses around that participation, telling themselves they were just conducting business, or just following tradition, or just responding to economic necessity. Isaiah stripped those defenses away using nothing more than memory and truth. He made them understand the specific human cost of their choices, and that understanding proved unbearable. This is the power of truthful witness. Isaiah didn't defeat slavery. The institution continued for another 23 years after his manumission, sustained by force, law, economic interest, and the willful blindness of millions. But he defeated 15 individual men's capacity to participate comfortably in that institution. He planted seeds of moral crisis that grew into changed behavior, freed slaves, withdrawn support for the system. Multiply that effect across enough individuals, and systems begin to collapse from within, not through external attack, but through internal recognition of their own evil. The enslaved understood this better than history often acknowledges. Physical resistance captured historical attention because it was dramatic, visible, easy to document. But quiet resistance, intellectual resistance, moral resistance, the daily acts of maintaining dignity and humanity in circumstances designed to destroy both, these forms of resistance were equally important and perhaps more effective long-term. Isaiah represented that tradition of resistance, using the gifts he possessed, memory and intelligence, to wage war against the minds of men who claimed to own human beings. We don't know what happened to Isaiah after he left Charleston. Perhaps he lived quietly in Philadelphia, building a life in freedom. Perhaps he continued his work, using his extraordinary memory to support abolitionist efforts with detailed accounts of slavery's operations. Perhaps he simply disappeared, his purpose accomplished. The historical record offers no definitive answers. But the legacy persists. 15 men changed. Countless enslaved people freed because of those changes. Documentation created that reveals slavery's operations with uncomfortable precision. And the demonstration that truth, spoken courageously to power, can accomplish what force cannot, can penetrate psychological defenses, can transform understanding, can make evil unbearable to those who participate in it. This is what we must remember when studying slavery, when examining any system of oppression. The people subjected to evil were not passive victims. They were intelligent, creative, resourceful individuals who resisted in countless ways, some dramatic but many quiet. They maintained families against systematic efforts to destroy those families. They preserved cultures despite prohibitions. They educated themselves despite laws forbidding literacy. They remembered who they were and where they came from, despite efforts to erase their identities. And some, like Isaiah Turner, found ways to weaponize their gifts against the system that tried to break them.
Isaiah's story also reminds us about complicity. The 15 men he educated weren't uniquely evil. They were products of their culture, participants in a system they'd inherited, people who told themselves comfortable lies about necessity and tradition. But comfortable lies remain lies, and Isaiah forced them to stop lying to themselves. That's uncomfortable work, forcing people to see their complicity, but it's necessary work. Evil persists not just through active cruelty, but through passive participation, through people who go along because it's easier than resistance, who benefit from injustice while telling themselves they're not responsible. Every person in that chain of complicity, from plantation owners to merchants to politicians to ministers to auctioneers, played a role in maintaining slavery. Each told themselves they weren't really responsible, that they were just doing their jobs or following tradition or responding to economic pressures.
Isaiah made them understand that responsibility cannot be so easily evaded, that participation is complicity regardless of the justifications we construct. The question Isaiah's story poses to us today is uncomfortable. What systems do we participate in while maintaining comfortable distance from their human cost? What injustices do we benefit from while telling ourselves we're not responsible? What elaborate justifications have we constructed to avoid confronting our own complicity in systematic wrongs? These questions apply across time because human nature changes slowly. We're just as capable of self-deception as those Charleston planters were, just as skilled at constructing psychological defenses around our participation in evil. Isaiah Turner forces us to imagine what it would mean to truly see ourselves, to strip away justifications and face our choices honestly. That's terrifying work. It destroyed 15 men psychologically because they couldn't survive that level of self-knowledge while maintaining their previous lives. But maybe that terror is necessary. Maybe we need our comfortable self-images destroyed if those self-images allow us to participate in injustice without guilt. The final lesson of Isaiah's story concerns memory itself. What Isaiah possessed was perfect recall, the inability to forget anything he'd witnessed. That gift became a weapon because slavery depended on selective memory, on forgetting or never acknowledging the humanity of people reduced to property. Isaiah refused that selective memory. He remembered everything. Every person sold, every family separated, every cruelty committed. And he forced others to remember too, to see what they'd chosen to ignore. Memory is resistance, remembering truthfully, refusing to forget, acknowledging what happened without comfortable distortions. This is how we prevent evil from repeating. Systems of oppression require forgetting, require the victim's stories to disappear, require comfortable narratives that erase uncomfortable truths. When we remember accurately, when we insist on truthful witness, we resist that erasure. We ensure that what happened continues to matter, that the people who suffered are not forgotten, that their resistance and resilience and humanity persist in historical consciousness. Isaiah Turner remembered. That was his gift and his weapon. He remembered people everyone else wanted to forget, stories everyone else wanted to erase, truths everyone else wanted to avoid. And through remembering, through speaking those memories aloud to men who claimed power over him, he changed reality. He forced acknowledgement of humanity that couldn't be denied once truly seen. He made evil unbearable to those who participated in it. That's what truthful memory can accomplish. Not just preservation of the past for historical interest, but transformation of the present through forced confrontation with what we'd rather ignore. Isaiah didn't defeat slavery through memory, but he defeated 15 men's capacity to participate comfortably in slavery. He planted seeds that grew into changed behavior, modified policies, freed people. Small victories, perhaps, measured against the vast machinery of institutional evil, but real victories nonetheless. Real people freed, real suffering reduced, real change accomplished through nothing more than truth spoken courageously. As we conclude this remarkable story, consider what it means for us today. Consider the systems we participate in, the injustices we benefit from, the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about our own righteousness. Consider what it would mean to truly see ourselves as Isaiah forced those 15 men to see themselves. That vision might destroy our comfort, but perhaps our comfort deserves destruction if it requires us to ignore others' suffering. Isaiah Turner lived in a time when slavery was legal, culturally accepted, economically entrenched, defended by politicians and ministers and intellectuals. Yet he found a way to resist, using the gifts he possessed to wage war against that system from within. His resistance didn't look like rebellion in the traditional sense. It looked like remembering, speaking truth, refusing to accept comfortable lies. But that resistance was real and powerful, and it changed lives. We honor Isaiah's memory not by treating him as superhuman, but by recognizing him as fully human. A man with extraordinary gifts, certainly, but also a man who chose to use those gifts courageously despite enormous personal risk. He could have remained silent, could have protected himself by never speaking dangerous truths to powerful men. Instead, he spoke again and again, knowing each truth told would likely result in another sale, another disruption, another cycle of temporary ownership and forced education. That courage, choosing to resist despite costs, choosing to speak truth despite dangers, choosing to maintain dignity and humanity in circumstances designed to destroy both, this is what we must remember and honor. This is the legacy of Isaiah Turner and countless others who resisted slavery in ways large and small, dramatic and quiet, violent and peaceful. They were not passive victims. They were active resistors, using whatever means available to fight for their humanity and freedom. The story ends not with easy resolution, but with ongoing questions. Isaiah disappeared from historical records, his final years unknown. The men he educated carried their psychological wounds until death. Slavery continued for decades after his manumission. Evil persisted despite his resistance. But resistance has value even when it doesn't immediately succeed. Seeds planted grow slowly. Changes in consciousness precede changes in law and culture. Isaiah's work mattered, even though it didn't end slavery. It changed specific lives, freed specific people, forced specific confrontations with truth that couldn't be undone. That's what resistance accomplishes, not dramatic immediate victory, but incremental change, person by person, mind by mind, conscience by conscience. Isaiah Turner changed 15 minds. Those 15 made changes that affected others. Effects ripple outward in ways we can't fully trace, but which nonetheless matter. Every person freed represents immeasurable value. Every mind changed represents potential for further change. Every truth spoken courageously makes the next truth slightly easier to speak. So we remember Isaiah Turner not as legend, but as real person, who lived real life and made real choices under real oppression. We remember the extraordinary gift he possessed and the courage he showed using that gift. We remember the men whose comfortable participation in evil he destroyed through nothing more than truthful witness. We remember that resistance takes many forms, and that intellectual and moral resistance can be as powerful as physical resistance. We remember that memory itself is resistance, that refusing to forget is a form of fighting back. And we commit ourselves to similar remembering, to seeing truly, to refusing comfortable lies about our own time and our own complicity. We honor Isaiah's legacy not through mere admiration, but through similar courage in our own contexts. We ask ourselves what truths we need to speak, what systems we need to challenge, what comfortable self-images we need to destroy in ourselves and others. This is the gift Isaiah Turner offers us across the centuries, not just his story, but the challenge his story represents. The challenge to remember truthfully, to speak courageously, to resist complicity, to maintain humanity regardless of circumstances.
That challenge remains as relevant today as it was in Charleston in 1842. How we respond to it defines not just our relationship to history, but our character in the present. If this story moved you, if Isaiah Turner's courage inspired you, if the questions his life poses challenged you, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We explore forgotten stories of resistance and resilience every week, uncovering the truth about people who fought against injustice using whatever means they possessed. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about real courage, real resistance, real humanity persisting under oppression. Leave a comment telling us what Isaiah's story means to you and how it challenges you to think differently about resistance, memory, and complicity. These stories matter. These lives matter. This history matters. And together, through remembering truthfully and speaking courageously, we ensure that the legacy of people like Isaiah Turner continues to inspire change in our own time.
Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story where we'll uncover another chapter of hidden history that demands to be remembered.